Alan Moore's Watchmen comic book series is widely considered to be atop the pinnacle of the genre. With the Cold War as its backdrop, the series introduced comic book-styled heroes who represented both the light and the dark. A morally ambiguous group of superpowered individuals who were as likely to murder as they were to save. Dollar Bill had corporate sponsors fueling his vigilantism. Captain Metropolis was an egotistical, racist cop, and the Silhouette was ousted from the Avengers of her world after preference for women outed her. History during the elementary and middle school years is often presented in a clean black or white dichotomy. True history is far more complicated. By high school, some of our elementary heroes, like Christopher Columbus, get flipped to the villain category after we discover his deeply held beliefs regarding slavery, as well as his wanton crucifixions of the indigenous population. Other historical figures, however, are far more difficult to deal with. 2 decades before the advent of the 20th century, a group of men seized the momentum to establish massive capitalistic empires which fueled the rise of an America that was on the precipice of achieving empire status. To some, they are the captains of industry, a group of men upon whose backs the greatness of America during this period was predicated. To others, they are robber barons, men of gluttonous, wanton excess whose exploitation entrenched the ills of capitalism for generations running. Either way, they are worth examining. You're listening to A Push Through History, a resource designed for students completing the course of APUSH History. This episode covers the second subject of Period 6, 1865 to 1898. Urban America. In 1877, the United States was overwhelmingly rural and dependent upon foreign capital. By 1917, the nation would be transformed to one of industry, ready to finally enter World War I and assert itself as a world power. United, for the most part against foreign enemies, many ignored the fact that the rapid industrial rise of America sharpened class divides, brought in millions of immigrants, and began to redefine gender relations. To understand the rise of the robber barons, we need to first set the stage for the Gilded Age, which spanned the period from 1870 to 1900, as this moment turned out to be uniquely suited to producing titans of industry. The post-Civil War economy boomed as Reconstruction ushered in new investments in infrastructure, particularly railroads, in order to connect once isolated markets in the South and far-flung California. The U.S. had always had abundant natural resources, with iron, coal, oil, and timber ripe for exploitation. Immigration brought millions of workers into the country, prepared to do their part playing the difficult role of the backbone of industrial labor via their willingness to work for meager wages under increasingly harsh conditions. New inventions such as the telegraph by Samuel Morse and electricity revolutionized communication and production, allowing factories to take orders and produce goods on a massive scale, while the newly constructed railroads awaited to transport them to markets nationwide. Throughout the Gilded Age, the federal government took a laissez-faire approach to the economy, helping to jumpstart corporations and staying out of their business once they were up and running. Specifically, the federal government provided land grants to railroads, imposed few regulations on businesses, and subsequently allowed monopolistic practices to flourish unimpeded. The courts assisted in the effort, often siding with corporations and inadvertently reinforcing the power of industrialists. resulting in the formation of America's first oligarchical rule. At the heart of the revolution was steel, a material stronger, lighter, and more versatile than iron. Its mass production changed everything from construction to transportation. But producing steel efficiently was a challenge until the advent of the Bessemer process. Developed in the 1850s, this process allowed for the mass production of steel by blasting air through molten iron to remove impurities. Although Henry Bessemer is often credited for its invention, an American named William Kelly claimed to have developed a similar technique earlier. While the controversy behind who deserves credit for the invention was tabloid fodder, the results were undeniable, as steel became both cheap and abundant. The urban landscape was soon transformed, with Chicago completing the Home Insurance Building, a 10-story high building which became the world's first skyscraper. Large bridges began to traverse the nation's widest waterways. These steel behemoths, like the Brooklyn Bridge, defied what Americans had believed was possible just a decade earlier. The changes eventually worked their way into America's homes, setting off the consumer revolution in the 1950s. Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant, saw steel's potential and built an empire by controlling every aspect of its production, eventually owning the iron mines that provided the raw materials, the railroads that transported them, and the steel mills which refined and processed them. This vertical integration eliminated middlemen and maximized profits. His accumulation of wealth is the quintessential rags to riches tale that makes up the American dream. Starting as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory, Carnegie worked his way up through grit and determination, eventually building up enough connections to receive a convenient tip that now was the precise time to transition from the railroad industry into the steel-making business. The efficiency of his vertical integration model allowed him to cut costs and outcompete rivals while amassing immense profits, eventually resulting in him pivoting to a system of horizontal integration, whereas he bought up the steel mills of his competitors. His success came at a very real cost, however, as his obsession with efficiency often led to ruthless labor practices, the most famous of which was the Homestead Strike of 1892. Workers protesting wage cuts locked themselves in Carnegie's Homestead plant. As an owner of such a vast industrial empire, Carnegie regularly left the management of labor disputes up to others. In this instance, Henry Frick decided that the best course of action to deal with the organized workers was to call in the Pinkerton Detective Agency, a professional group that had made a small fortune themselves by investigating, blackmailing, and breaking up organized labor. The resulting standoff quickly escalated out of control, leaving several killed and cementing Carnegie's reputation as a figure of both admiration and controversy, a captain of industry, and a robber baron. Carnegie's later years were marked by philanthropic efforts. Penning the essay The Gospel of Wealth, the so-called Prince of Steel espoused the notion that the rich had a moral obligation to give back to society. Putting his money where his mouth was, he donated vast sums to build libraries, universities, and cultural institutions. By the time of his death in 1919, Carnegie had given away over $350 million, the equivalent of billions today, solidifying his dual legacy. Carnegie wasn't alone in his monopolistic efforts. While steel was building the modern world, another resource was fueling it. Enter John D. Rockefeller, founder of Standard Oil and the archetype of a man with ruthless monopolistic ambition. He was the first to pounce on the concept of refining petroleum. Beyond just refining the kerosene, an early form of gasoline, he found uses for the byproducts of the refining process, selling paraffin to candle makers, petroleum jelly to medical supply companies, and other waste to create paving materials for roads. His empire benefited from horizontal integration. After buying out rival refineries, he controlled nearly 90% of the American oil market by the 1880s. He shipped so many goods that railroad companies drooled over the prospect of getting his business. But Rockefeller, also in it for a buck, demanded secret rebates from the railroads as a cost of doing business with him. These steep discounts gave him an unfair distribution advantage in relation to his competitors. To manage his vast holdings, Rockefeller created the Standard Oil Trust, an entity that allowed him to smoothly bypass state regulations. This move set the stage for the rise of monopolies, eventually prompting public outrage and government intervention. The Progressive era's Sherman Antitrust Act was designed to curb such practices. But it wasn't until 1911 that Standard Oil was broken up into smaller companies in order to foster competition which would bring down the exorbitant cost to consumers. Cornelius Vanderbilt created a minor transportation empire. He recognized that railroads were the arteries of the industrial economy and set about becoming the largest player in the transportation business. Although he began the process with steamboats, Vanderbilt became a titan by consolidating smaller rail lines into powerful interconnected networks. Like others, he benefited unfairly from generous government land grants and subsidies. The money flowed so freely due to the absence of any government regulation that it became impossible to believe that the process would remain clean. In order to maneuver his competitor, Central Railroad, into selling to him, he banned their passengers and freight on his New York and Harlem lines, meaning that his opponent's business was soon unable to connect to cities out west. Faced either with going belly up or handing over the keys to their hated rival, they eventually sold. Vanderbilt would go on to control all railroads from New York City to Chicago, amassing over $100 million by the time of his death. J.P. Morgan became the kingpin of Wall Street, dominating the banking industry. Unlike a number of the other captains of industry, Morgan started out with a head start, as his father had already amassed a small fortune within this industry. He took advantage of the economic panic of 1893 to secure enough railroad stock to become one of the largest railroad owners in the world, building up such a sizable fortune that the U.S. government turned to him for a loan to privately stabilize the economy. Rather than continuing to build up his own empire and eventually colliding with Vanderbilt, Morgan used his wealth to purchase the established kingdoms of others, buying up General Electric and Carnegie Steel Company, which he then merged into U.S. Steel. Despite the great sums of money involved, he was able to double his investment in a mere 10 years. Henry Ford revolutionized the automobile industry by creating the assembly line, which dramatically increased production efficiency and thereby lowered costs. The result was the ultra-affordable Model T car. Despite the low profit margins which made the car affordable to ordinary Americans, Ford was able to introduce to his workers a $5 wage per day, significantly improving his workers' living standards. Vertical and horizontal integration, the influx of cheap immigrant labor, lax oversight by the federal government, and predatory pricing to undercut their competitors created these captains of industry. On one hand, they modernized America, built infrastructure, and funded cultural institutions through their philanthropic efforts. On the other hand, they exploited workers, crushed competition, and manipulated the system for their personal gain. Workers fought back where they could, but the task of opposing both their bosses and the government oftentimes proved futile. The Civil War had resulted in a national debt that reached an astonishing $2.8 billion. The government desperately needed an infusion of capital, which only the captains of industry were able to provide. There were no income taxes at this time period, meaning that the Treasury had to regularly use foreign tariffs to secure revenue. While the Democrats argued that tariffs were a tax on the American consumer, Republicans justified the cost by claiming that they served to protect emerging American businesses from foreign competition. Both were correct, as the revenue accumulated erased the debt from the Civil War and established a budget surplus as early as 1880. At the same time, corporations accumulated massive benefits from the tariffs, which they regularly failed to pass on the cost savings to their workers, creating industrial poverty in the U.S. States attempted to fill the void of federal action, bringing the case Munn v. Illinois in 1877 in order to secure the right for states to regulate key businesses that were deemed in the public interest. The Supreme Court, however, used the 14th Amendment to shield corporations from state action unless they received due process first. That ruling began the process of treating corporations as though they were individual citizens. That process eventually culminated in the Citizens United case, which opened up the political world to corporate money in the form of protected free speech. Incredibly, that same Gilded Age Supreme Court rejected the use of the 14th Amendment to use due process to shield the rights of African Americans in the Jim Crow South, despite the fact that that had been the precise purpose of the Reconstruction-era amendment. Although their plight was radically different from African Americans in the South, laborers throughout the nation similarly suffered against the weight of an entrenched group of privileged individuals intent on designing a system that unfairly favored them. For the workers who toiled in the factories, mines, and railroads of the Gilded Age, life was often brutal. Long hours, low pay, and unsafe working conditions were the norm. While the industrialists amassed wealth, the laboring class began organizing to demand better treatment. One of the most dramatic examples of labor resistance was the Pullman strike of 1894. George Pullman, the founder of the Pullman Company, had constructed a company town near Chicago for his workers. Pullman Town was designed to be a model community, providing its residents with clean housing, schools, and shops. In reality, though, the company controlled every aspect of life, from rent to local ordinances. The debt accumulated from its underpaid workers essentially re-established the feudal system, as workers lost the ability to move from job to job for fear that they would be evicted from their home or be forced to pay off their accumulated debts. In such a system, workers had virtually no autonomy, and their wages often failed to cover the high rents charged by the company. When the Panic of 1893 threatened the economy, Pullman cut wages but didn't lower rents, resulting in widespread anger among the workers and residents of Pullman Town. The situation boiled over the next year as workers went on strike. The American Railway Union, or ARU, led by Eugene Debs, lent its support, calling for a nationwide boycott of trains which transported Pullman railway cars. The strike paralyzed rail traffic across the country, drawing national attention to the plight of the residents. The federal government quickly intervened, siding with the railroads due to the widespread negative economic effects of the workers' strike. When mediation stalled, President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops to forcibly break the workers' will, resulting in violent clashes that left dozens dead. The failure of the strike sent shockwaves through the nation, as it revealed that America stood with the bosses rather than with the people. In reaction to a number of high-profile strikes, including Homestead and Pullman, workers began to realize that individual protests were insufficient against the might of industrial titans. Labor unions, which organized workers across industries, emerged as a powerful force. Organizations such as the Knights of Labor, founded in 1869, sought to unite all workers, skilled and unskilled, men and women, white and black in most instances, beneath one banner. Their main focus was in securing an 8-hour workday, better wages, and improved working conditions. Another significant organization worth knowing was the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, which was founded in 1886 by Samuel Gompers. Unlike the Knights of Labor, the AFL focused on skilled workers while seeking only incremental changes rather than monumental sweeping reforms. This pragmatic approach made the AFL more durable, despite the fact that it often excluded marginalized groups. Not everyone was a supporter of labor unions. Better pay and less hours would directly affect the profits going into the owners' pockets. Their desire to continue raking in the profits often resulted in them passing on the costs to the consumer, leading to price increases throughout the interconnected economy. The Haymarket Affair of 1886 further turned Americans away from organized labor. The incident occurred on May 4, 1886, in the busy streets of Chicago. Workers had gathered for what should have been a peaceful rally at Haymarket Square, only to have the day end in tragedy. As day turned to night, police arrived to disperse the remaining crowd. It was then that an unknown assailant threw a bomb into the police ranks, killing one officer instantly and injuring several others. Chaos erupted as police opened fire, and by the time the smoke cleared, 7 officers and several civilians lay dead upon the streets of Chicago. The bombing sent shockwaves throughout the nation. Authorities quickly blamed anarchists and labor organizers, leading to a highly publicized controversial trial. 8 men, many of whom had not even been present when the bomb was thrown, were convicted in what is widely regarded as an unjust proceeding. 4 of them were hanged, 1 committed suicide in prison, while the others faced lengthy sentences. Despite the tragedy, the Haymarket Affair became a rallying cry for the labor movement. The executed men were hailed as martyrs, and in 1890 the event inspired the creation of the International Workers' Day, observed yearly on May 1st in many countries as a day of labor solidarity. Eventually, the adoption of an 8-hour workday was realized in part to the sacrifices that had been made in Chicago and elsewhere. The economic transformation dramatically affected the culture and demographics of the nation. In 1860, America remained largely rural. By 1910, however, a majority of Americans lived in urban centers. The population growth was staggering, as more Americans now lived in cities than had lived in the entire nation on the eve of the Civil War, 50 years earlier. America now claimed 3 of the largest cities in the world, and the industrial Midwest had begun to catch up to the Northeast. On the West Coast, Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles became hubs for growth, while the South witnessed the emergence of Atlanta and Birmingham as large metropolitan centers. By 1905, America had entered its urban age. Fires, earthquakes, and other large-scale disasters had caused devastation, but in the same way that a prairie fire renewed the soil on the Great Plains, allowing for tremendous regrowth, these tragedies enabled the cities to be better planned, eventually utilizing newly developed systems of mass transit, such as steam-driven cable cars, electric trolleys, and in New York City, an elevated train line. Boston quickly did its rival city one better, creating the first underground subway line in 1897. Steel allowed the 10-story home insurance building in Chicago to scrape the sky, but it was quickly surpassed by the 55-story Woolworth building that was completed in 1913 in New York. Electricity lit up the cities at night, helping to reassure its citizens that they were safe from crime, with many residents claiming that a light is as good as a policeman. The wealthy built up specialty districts, such as New York's Madison Avenue, or pushed outward in overly designed suburbs, while the relatively poor workers were forced to rent in shoddy tenements. These 5 to 6 story buildings typically stuffed 3 to 4 individuals into each crowded bedroom, while providing just one communal bathroom for the entire building. The overcrowding conditions gave rise to high rates of infant mortality and disease. In the New York 11th Ward, there was an average of 986 people per acre of land. While many wanted to remove this blight from their city streets, the reformers were thwarted by the economic facts of urban development. The wages of industrial workers remained artificially low, in large part because of competition with immigrants. That meant that they were largely unable to afford transportation and therefore had to live near their jobs. That only worsened as commercial development, particularly the advent of the department store, pushed up land values to such an extent that only high-density, cheaply built housing earned landlords a significant profit. African Americans, just beginning to leave the South for the cities of the North, often suffered the most, as they were relegated to the least healthy buildings. Although their numbers wouldn't peak until the 1930s, this initial trickle laid the groundwork for what would become one of the largest internal migrations in American history. These early migrators had already come to recognize the dangers inherent to the Jim Crow South. Urged on by Northern relatives, they fled the South for cities like Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Gary, and New York, unwilling to fall for Henry Grady's propaganda regarding a New South. Although they had anticipated well-paying factory jobs, Black Americans during this period were oftentimes forced to accept work on the lowest rung of the economic ladder, becoming janitors, doormen, and other simple professions. Brothels, slums, pollution, diseases, and corrupt political machines surrounded the move-ins, resulting in one African American observer identifying cities as civilization's inferno. But the inferno didn't result in the melting pot, creating one united culture that some expected. One journalist in 1908 captured the growing racial crisis with this statement: "In every important northern city, a distinct race problem already exists, which must, in a few years, assume serious proportions." And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would remark 30 years later that "I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hateful as I've seen here in Chicago." The large influx of African Americans sparked a backlash from the white majority, resulting in the move-ins facing housing segregation, labor discrimination, and race-based violence. In New York City's Tenderloin district, an altercation between a black man and a white police officer resulted in white mobs descending on black neighborhoods, attacking residents and destroying businesses. The officer wasn't in uniform, but had arrested a black woman on suspicion of prostitution. Her companion confronted the out-of-uniform officer, who promptly smacked him with his billy club. Afraid for his life, the black man grabbed his penknife and stabbed the officer 3 times in the stomach before fleeing in fear of his life. Riots broke out throughout the Tenderloin district, forcing police to close down the area for the night. A cooling off period typically brings down the temperature, restoring reason. The district's residents, however, were awoken the next day to discover a large crowd chasing down a terrified man. Those that watched the scene unfold would have seen one brave woman fighting off the rioters armed only with a large knife. But as the day went on, new skirmishes popped up across the Tenderloin district. Eventually, the fighting was suppressed by hundreds of police officers beating the men and women of the district into submission. Despite widespread accounts of police brutality, the men that pulled the strings at Tammany Hall made sure that not a single officer was charged. Similar violence erupted in Evansville, Indiana, after a black man was accused of killing a white police officer. And in 1908, the hometown of Abraham Lincoln, Springfield, Illinois, lynched several black residents over rumors of black men assaulting white women. The violence in each of these cities shocked the nation and highlighted the precarious position of developing black communities in the North. In partial response to the problem of tenement slums, New York City passed extensive housing codes to require interior courts, indoor toilets, and fire safeguards for new buildings, but neglected to apply those standards to the 44,000 tenements that already existed. Immigrants were at the nexus of everything fueling industrial growth while adding to the development of each city's unique culture. The Gilded Age saw a new sustained flow of Irish immigrants who were pushed out of the Emerald Isle by the devastating effects of continued British colonial policies. By 1900, around 4.5 million Irish had settled in the U.S., particularly in cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Many took low-wage jobs in construction, canal building, and factory labor. Unique to the Irish immigrants, women arrived at Ellis Island on their own in order to seek a new life in America. These single women dominated domestic service roles for wealthy families. Despite their largely positive contributions to American infrastructure, the Irish faced severe discrimination, as they had to deal with both anti-Catholic and anti-Irish sentiments. There were even arguments made by nativist groups that the Irish were an entire different race than the settlers of Protestant England and other mainland European countries. Stereotypes depicting the Irish as unruly, drunken, or untrustworthy led to employment barriers, epitomized by the "No Irish Need Apply" signs that were common in job postings. Over time, however, the Irish established strong community networks through Catholic churches and labor unions. Irish men were among the leaders of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the Haymarket Affair in 1886. In addition to labor movements, they also became deeply involved in Democratic Party politics, where political machines like Tammany Hall in New York City provided them jobs, housing, and social services in exchange for their votes. Jewish immigration also surged during the Gilded Age, resulting in the arrival of more than 2 million Jews, most of whom were from Eastern Europe. They fled religious persecution, economic hardship, and political instability emanating from the Russian Empire. pogroms, violent state-sanctioned attacks on Jewish communities, were a major push factor, forcing many Jewish families to seek safety in America. Upon their arrival, Jewish immigrants primarily settled in urban centers, with New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Boston all serving as enclaves for the Jewish settlers. They lived in densely packed neighborhoods, which featured bustling markets that met their dietary restrictions, as well as contained synagogues and other communal organizations designed to help the new arrivals maintain their cultural heritage while simultaneously adjusting to life in America. Many Jewish immigrants worked in the garment industry, often enduring poor working conditions in sweatshops. Suggesting that the American dream was for all of its citizens, some later rose to become factory owners and labor leaders, contributing heavily to the rise of trade unions such as the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Despite their relative success in America, Jewish immigrants faced anti-Semitism, particularly from nativist groups that sought to limit non-Protestant immigration. The restrictive Nationwide Immigration Act of 1924 was largely designed to curb Jewish immigration. It established quotas for an immigrant's birth nation and tied them to the population of the nation in 1924. Thus, some nations, including Ireland, received a significantly larger allotment of visas than others. Another group which was artificially limited were the Chinese. Economic hardship in China and the allure of opportunities in the American West drew Chinese laborers, nearly all of which were men who had paid for the expense through a credit ticket system, akin to old indentured servitude agreements. They largely came to work on the western side of the Transcontinental Railroad, in gold mines, and in agriculture. By 1880, more than 100,000 Chinese immigrants had made America their new home. But as anti-Chinese sentiment grew, many Chinese immigrants banded together to form tight-knit communities, which became known as Chinatowns. Far from slums, the Chinatown of San Francisco emerged as a cultural and economic hub, which provided immigrants social support, employment opportunities, and protection from racialized violence. As their presence grew, Washington passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first U.S. law to specifically ban immigration based upon nationality. This act severely restricted Chinese immigration, making it nearly impossible for immigrants to become U.S. citizens. It also led to increased violence, including the Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming, where white miners slaughtered at least 28 Chinese workers, and the Tacoma riot, in which mobs forcibly expelled 700 Chinese residents from the Washington Territory. In that instance, a mob consisting of prominent businessmen, police, and political leaders escorted the city's Chinese residents to put them on a train to Portland. With that finished, they then proceeded to raze all the structures that had housed their Chinese residents. Rather than being shamed for their actions, the nation proclaimed this as the Tacoma Method, for reclaiming their cities from the Chinese migrants who had come to America seeking their own fortune, while simultaneously helping to build up their new nation. Los Angeles chose not to adopt the Tacoma Method, instead attempting to drive out its Chinese residents by initiating the Chinese Massacre of 1871, during which mobs descended upon Chinatown, lynching at least 18 residents. Despite these challenges, Chinese immigrants persevered, establishing businesses such as laundries and restaurants, while playing a crucial role in developing industries such as farming and fishing along the Pacific coast. Chinatown sustained themselves, eventually becoming vital centers of cultural preservation. Before we finish up this discussion on industrialization, labor, and immigration during the Gilded Age, I would like to go backwards just a bit to include some information about the Mormon migration from Illinois to Salt Lake City. That migration occurred slightly before the advent of the Gilded Age, spurred on by the killing of the religion's founder, Joseph Smith. The Mormons, or Church of Latter-day Saints, is a Christian denomination that often gets overlooked among America's Catholic-Protestant divide. The faith was discovered in 1830 when Joseph Smith claims to have been visited by an angel who informed him that God's third holy book had been written upon golden plates, which were buried by an ancient prophet who had recorded the experience of the lost tribes of Israel while it wandered throughout indigenous America. Although Smith claimed that he had possession of the tablets, he had been sworn to secrecy by the angel, limiting how quickly Smith could convince others to accept this new interpretation of the Christian story. Among other things, the Church of Latter-day Saints believes that America, rather than Israel, is the Promised Land, and that the Spirit of Jesus had visited the continent during the 3 days which he had laid buried awaiting resurrection. While the movement grew rapidly beneath Smith's leadership, they moved west to Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois in hopes of avoiding religious persecution from other Christian denominations, many of which targeted the Church of Latter-day Saints for its tolerance of polygamy. Smith ran for president in 1844, which only increased fear of the group, inspiring rivals to publicly attack the church's leaders via the press, including one in Illinois that Smith ordered to be destroyed. The resulting threat of violence made Smith call out a militia in the town of Nauvoo, Illinois, an action which resulted in him being imprisoned for the charge of treason and conspiracy against the state of Illinois. Although he should have been safe behind bars, a mob stormed the prison and murdered Joseph Smith and his brother in cold blood. The death of their prophet had made it abundantly clear that Illinois wasn't the welcoming place that the church had envisioned. 2 years after the death of their founder, the Mormons, beneath the leadership of Brigham Young, began an exodus of persecuted Latter-day Saints from Nauvoo, Illinois to Salt Lake City, Utah. More than 3,000 families came with 2,500 wagons. The trek was deadly for many, as the makeshift shelters provided virtually no relief from the elements. Although they would cross a total of 1,300 miles, the first 310 proved to be the most difficult, taking the inexperienced travelers a full 135 days. In Omaha, Nebraska, their winter quarters resulted in 15% of the camp members dying from scurvy, resulting in Young's son identifying the settlement as the Valley Forge of Mormondom. Seeking to avoid the more commonly used Oregon Trail, Young guided them through the Rocky Mountains, announcing that it is enough. This is the right place upon reaching the Valley of the Great Salt Lake. Over the course of 2 decades, more than 60,000 Mormons would journey to the Utah Territory in search of a permanent home for their faith. The challenges associated with the pre-Gilded Age migration just highlighted the benefits that steel and its resulting transcontinental railroad granted to a nation which had recently achieved its manifest destiny. While the Mormons would develop Salt Lake City into a fantastic city, it lacked the entertainment factors of the more populated urban centers that would spring up during the Gilded Age. We'll explore those and the politics of the era in our next episode.